Please subscribe to support the channel. You think you're just a brain inside a skull, neurons firing, chemicals flowing, end of story. But when you look closely at how your brain works and how the physical world works at the smallest scales, that simple picture starts to crack. The question is not, is your brain active? The question is, what exactly is it interacting with when you are conscious? Start with the basic, standard view. Your brain is made of neurons, about 80 billion of them. Each neuron sends electrical spikes down long fibers called axons, and those spikes jump across gaps called synapses using chemicals. A neuron either fires or it doesn't, and these spikes can happen from about once per second up to hundreds of times per second. When millions of neurons are doing this together, you get rhythms, patterns of activity. When we put an EEG cap on your head, we see these rhythms as bands. Alpha waves around 10 times per second when you're relaxed with your eyes closed. Beta waves when you're alert and doing tasks. Gamma waves around 40 times per second when you're really paying attention or having a conscious moment of insight. In this view, the brain is a complex but basically classical electrical network, like an unbelievably advanced circuit operating in the frequency range from about 1 to 100 Hertz. So far, this is straightforward engineering. Spikes go in, spikes go out. Networks transform inputs into outputs. But here's the part that does not fit that clean story. None of this explains why anything feels like something from the inside. Why does a particular pattern of spikes feel like the color red, or like fear, or like the memory of your first school? You can, in principle, copy the spikes in a simulation on a normal computer. You can model the network structure. You can reproduce the behavior. Yet, nowhere in the equations does a line appear that says this activity equals a subjective experience. That gap between physical processing and the feeling of being you is the hard problem. So the obvious next question is, are we missing a deeper layer of physics in the brain? To even ask that, you need a minimal toolkit from quantum physics in normal language. At the atomic scale, particles don't sit in one definite place until they're measured. They exist in superposition, which just means a spread of possibilities. An electron in an atom isn't orbiting like a planet. It's described by a cloud of probabilities, and when you check, you get one outcome, chosen according to those probabilities. Then there's entanglement. You prepare two particles in a shared state, separate them, and measure them far apart. The results are correlated in a way that no classical explanation with hidden settings can reproduce. Experiments by Aspect, Zeilinger, Clauser, and many others have tested this. They use inequalities that set a hard limit for any classical theory. Quantum mechanics breaks that limit. The numbers come out higher than any local classical model allows. The universe is giving you non-local correlations whether you like it or not. But if the world is this strange at small scales, why doesn't your everyday world look quantum? Why aren't your keys in your phone in superposition on the table? The answer is decoherence. Quantum states are very delicate. When a system interacts with its environment, information about its state leaks out into the surroundings, and the neat superposition effectively collapses into a definite outcome. For large, warm, messy systems like biological tissue at body temperature, the typical time for a quantum state to stay coherent is incredibly short, tiny fractions of a trillionth of a second, roughly between a millionth of a billionth and a 10 billionth of a billionth of a second. That is why most physicists say the brain is too hot, too noisy, and too wet to keep useful quantum states alive long enough to affect thought. So if quantum effects die that fast, why even bring them into the discussion of consciousness? Because your brain is not just a random lump of warm tissue. It has structure on many levels. It has layered cortex, precise connection patterns, feedback loops, and large-scale rhythms that link distant regions. When you become conscious of something, you don't just see one small area light up. You see coherent activity across the brain. In EEG and MEG recordings, you see widespread gamma band synchrony, around 40 times per second, when people report a conscious perception. You see different regions phase lock, meaning their rhythms line up in time like gears meshing. This kind of large-scale coherence is not a trivial feature. It means the system is organizing its activity in a global, tightly coordinated way. So here is the tension. On one hand, quantum effects in warm, wet systems should vanish almost instantly. On the other hand, you have a biological system that shows strong, long-range coherence at the scale of entire brain regions whenever consciousness is present. Some researchers argue that this coherence is just what a classical network does when it integrates information. Others suggest it might be the visible, slow shadow of much faster, deeper coordination happening at smaller, possibly quantum scales that we don't currently measure. If a system is highly ordered and synchronized, maybe it can shelter or organize tiny quantum events better than we expect from crude estimates. At this point, you might ask, what would it even mean for your brain to be quantum in a functional way, not as a buzzword, but as a mechanism? The simplest idea is not that your thoughts are magical, it's that microscopic quantum events inside neurons could be amplified into the larger electrical patterns we see as brainwaves. We already know biology can do this. In your eye, single photons can trigger chemical changes that lead to large electrical signals. A single particle event can cascade into a big classical effect. So extend that logic. If there are specific structures in neurons that can hold quantum states for slightly longer, and if their behavior can influence when and how neurons fire, then quantum-level processes could in principle shape the large-scale rhythms linked to consciousness. When people say your mind might be a quantum antenna, the strict version of that claim is simple. Your brain could be a physical system that is especially good at sensing, organizing, and amplifying subtle quantum information that already exists in the underlying fields of reality. Conscious experience would then be what it is like from the inside when that system locks into a particular organized pattern of activity that is partly shaped by quantum-level events. You are not floating above physics, you are physics, arranged in a very specific way. If that is even partly correct, a new set of questions opens up. Is consciousness fully local, confined to the wet kilogram of tissue in your skull, or is it partly tied to non-local quantum correlations that link different parts of the system, and maybe even couple you weakly to the wider universe? Is the brain generating consciousness all by itself, like a self-contained computer? Or is it more like a device that has to interact with deeper layers of reality to produce what you feel as awareness? This first step sets up everything that follows. To test any of this, we need to go down inside the neuron to structures that might actually support quantum processes. We need to look at how anesthetic can shut down your entire conscious world while leaving basic brain activity running. And we need to study real examples in biology where quantum effects already matter. Because if your everyday awareness really depends on hidden quantum processes, then the line between you and the rest of the universe is a lot thinner than it looks right now. And the next question becomes unavoidable. What does the quantum world actually do when you look at it, and when you don't? You just heard the claim that your mind might be tied to the quantum world, so now you need to see what that world actually does when nobody is talking about consciousness at all. No hype, just the hard experiments that forced physicists to admit reality doesn't behave the way common sense says it should. Start with one of the most famous setups in physics, the double-slit experiment. Imagine a wall with two tiny openings, and behind it a screen that can register hits. You fire a stream of particles, photons or electrons, at the slits. If these were just little bullets, you'd expect two bright bands on the back screen, one for each slit. But when you let both slits stay open, and you don't check which slit each particle goes through, you get an interference pattern, many bright and dark stripes. That's what you see with waves, like ripples on water, not with bullets. Now here's the part that really breaks intuition. You can turn the stream down so low that you're firing one photon at a time. The screen records single, isolated hits, one, then another, then another. For a long time, it looks like random noise, but as you collect more and more hits, they build up the same interference pattern. Each photon sent alone behaves like it somehow knew about both slits and interfered with itself. So you might say, fine, the photon goes through both slits as a kind of spread-out wave until it hits the screen. But then we add one more piece. You put detectors at the slits to check which slit each photon actually passes through. The moment you do that, the interference pattern disappears. You go back to two simple bands, as if the photons suddenly behave like ordinary particles again. The only thing you changed was whether you gained information about which path they took. When you don't look, the statistics say they behave like waves going through both slits. When you do look, the statistics say they behave like particles going through one slit or the other. The data on the screen does not lie. Reality at that scale does not pick a side in the way you expect until an interaction forces it to. And that's already strange, but it gets worse when you look at entanglement, when two particles share one story. In these experiments, you create a pair of particles in a joint quantum state, for example with linked polarizations or spins. Then you send them to opposite sides of a lab, or to different buildings, or even kilometers apart. On each side, an experimenter chooses how to measure their particle in one of several possible ways. If there were hidden classical settings inside each particle, fixed when they were created, there's a hard mathematical limit on how strong the correlations between their answers can be. That limit shows up as a number in something called a Bell-type inequality. Classical theories cannot push that number above a certain value, which is 2 in the most famous version. But when people actually run these experiments, starting in the 1980s and getting cleaner and cleaner over the decades, they keep finding violations of that classical bound. Instead of results lining up with at most 2, the correlation strength comes out around 2.4 to 2.7 depending on the exact setup. In the last 10 years, teams have done loophole-free tests, closing the main technical gaps that critics pointed to. The pattern holds. The data matches quantum theory and breaks every classical local model. You still cannot send a message faster than light with this. There's no instant phone line. You only see the weird correlations when you bring the data from both sides together later. But you are forced to accept this universe allows non-local correlations that no classical hidden story can fully explain. So now you have two key ideas on the table: superposition, where a system exists as a spread of possibilities until an interaction happens, and entanglement, where systems share one unified description no matter how far apart they are. The next question is obvious. If small systems can do this, why doesn't everything around you act this way all the time? That's where decoherence comes in. Superposition is not magic, it's just a very delicate state. Any interaction with the environment, with stray photons, air molecules, vibrations, heat, leaks information about the system into the surroundings. That process destroys the neat phase-coherent superposition and leaves you with an ordinary mixture of outcomes. In practice, that means quantum behavior is easy to lose. In the lab, to keep quantum states alive, researchers go to extreme lengths. Superconducting qubits sit in refrigerators close to absolute zero, shielded from radiation and vibration. Trapped ions float in vacuums with carefully controlled electromagnetic fields. Under these conditions, people can keep quantum states coherent from microseconds to milliseconds, sometimes longer, which is already a big deal when your devices are switching billions of times per second. But compare that to the brain. Your brain sits at body temperature, bathed in salty fluid packed with moving molecules, constantly bombarded by thermal noise. If you just plug those conditions into standard decoherence estimates, you get coherence times that are insanely short, way shorter than the timescales of neural firing or conscious perception. That's why the default answer in mainstream physics and neuroscience is quantum effects in the brain must average out too fast to matter. However, you can't stop at the slogan, too warm and wet. Nature clearly finds ways, in some cases, to keep quantum effects alive much longer than naive estimates suggest, even at room temperature. Look at quantum biology. In certain photosynthetic complexes, the machinery plants and bacteria use to capture light, experiments have shown evidence of electronic excitations moving through the structure in a wave-like, coherent way. Signals in these systems don't just randomly hop from one molecule to another. For short windows of time, on the order of hundreds of femtoseconds, which is a fraction of a trillionth of a second, the system seems to explore multiple paths at once, and that coherence helps optimize energy transfer. It's short, but it's real, and it happens in a warm, wet environment. Then take bird navigation. Some migratory birds, like European robins, appear to sense the Earth's magnetic field using proteins called cryptochromes in their eyes. One leading idea is that light hitting these molecules creates pairs of electrons in a correlated quantum-sensitive state, so-called radical pairs. The way these pairs evolve depends on the direction of the magnetic field, and that change affects the chemistry, giving the bird directional information. That is a direct link between a quantum process and a macroscopic behavior, finding north. There is still active debate and research, but the evidence is strong enough that this is taken very seriously. Another possible example is smell. One line of research suggests that olfactory receptors may not only respond to the shape of molecules, but also to how they vibrate, with electrons tunneling through an energy barrier in a way that is sensitive to the vibrational spectrum. Tunneling is a purely quantum effect. It allows particles to pass through barriers they could never cross classically. If this is how some receptors work, then quantum processes are literally part of how you detect odors, not just in principle, but in everyday life. Now step back and connect the dots. You have hard data from physics showing that superposition and entanglement are real, measurable, and not optional. You have decoherence telling you that quantum states are fragile, but you also have concrete examples where life has evolved machinery that uses these effects, even in messy conditions. So the question shifts. It's no longer, does biology ever use quantum tricks? Because the answer to that is already yes. The real question becomes, how far up the ladder of complexity do these tricks go? If plants can use quantum coherence to move energy efficiently, if birds can use quantum-sensitive reactions to navigate, if maybe even smell uses tunneling, then why assume the brain, the most complex organ we know, is strictly forbidden from touching any of this? This doesn't mean every wild claim about quantum consciousness is true. Most of them aren't. But it does mean the door is open for serious models where specific quantum processes inside brain cells play a role in how consciousness works. And that pushes us to a very precise challenge, to find out whether there are structures inside neurons that could actually support these kinds of states in a useful way, without being destroyed instantly by noise. Because if there is any place in your body that quantum behavior could matter for your mind, it has to live somewhere concrete, in real physical structures, not in vague talk. That means we have to zoom in, far beyond the textbook neuron diagram, down into the scaffolding of the cell itself, to the level where some researchers think the true quantum machinery might sit, and where critics say the whole idea falls apart. You've seen neurons in simple diagrams, blobs with branches and a wire, but that cartoon leaves out almost everything that matters for the quantum story. If your brain is going to do anything beyond ordinary electrical signaling, the real action has to be hiding way below that level, inside the cells themselves. Start with the part you already half know. A neuron is basically an information highway. It has dendrites, the branching input tree where thousands of other neurons connect. It has an axon, the long output cable that can run millimeters or even more than a meter in big animals. At rest, the neuron sits with a voltage across its membrane. When enough input arrives at once, that voltage flips and a sharp electrical pulse and action potential shoots down the axon. That spike travels at about 100 meters per second along insulated axons, slower on bare ones. When it reaches the end, it triggers the release of neurotransmitter molecules into the synapse. Those molecules cross the gap, bind to receptors on the next cell, and change its voltage, making it more or less likely to fire its own spike. Your brain has on the order of 80 to 90 billion of these neurons, firing away while you watch this. All of that runs on about 20 watts of power, similar to a cheap light bulb. That's not much energy to support your entire conscious world. The details of when each neuron fires, the exact timing of spikes and their rates, line up with what you see, hear, and do. Change the pattern, and you change perception and behavior. So from a classical point of view, you could say, that's it. That's the whole story. Input comes in, spikes move through networks, output comes out. So the obvious objection is, if this level seems to explain so much, why dig deeper? Because this whole structure sits inside cells that are far from simple. Each neuron is packed with internal scaffolding, transport systems, and nanoscale machines. If quantum processes are going to matter, they have to live somewhere specific in that machinery, not in vague energy or vibes. One serious candidate is a set of structures called microtubules. So what are those, really? Inside every neuron and almost every cell in your body, there's a cytoskeleton, an internal framework that gives the cell shape and helps it move and divide. Microtubules are a major part of that. They're hollow cylinders, about 25 nanometers across, made of repeating protein building blocks called tubulin dimers. These dimers line up in rows that wrap around to form the tube wall. Microtubules are dynamic. They grow and shrink. They form tracks along which motor proteins like kinesin and dynein walk, hauling cargo like vesicles and organelles to where they're needed. They play a crucial role in cell division, pulling chromosomes apart. Tubulin itself is not a rigid block. It can flip between different conformational states, different shapes, driven by chemical reactions like the breakdown of GTP molecules. So even in standard biology, microtubules are not just passive beams. They're active, switching, vibrating, forming ordered arrays that fill the axons and dendrites of neurons. That raises a sharp question. Are they just mechanical support and transport rails? Or could this ordered dynamic lattice also be doing information processing, maybe even on a quantum level? This is where the Penrose-Hameroff Orch-OR proposal comes in. It is one of the most detailed and most controversial quantum consciousness models. The idea starts with the tubulin dimers. Hameroff suggests that each dimer can exist in a superposition of at least two different conformational states, linked to different charge distributions inside the protein. If that's true, then a microtubule, made from huge numbers of these dimers, could hold a large quantum state, like a register of many quantum bits. In this picture, microtubules inside neurons don't just support the cell, they act as quantum computers, carrying out complex quantum-level computations that interact with the larger neural firing patterns. Penrose adds another piece, objective reduction, or OR. He argues that superpositions involving different mass distributions are fundamentally unstable because of gravity. The idea is that if you have a quantum state where matter is in two distinct configurations at once, those two configurations curve spacetime differently. Keeping both versions alive strains the structure of spacetime itself. According to Penrose, when the difference in gravitational energy between those alternatives reaches a certain scale, the superposition can't hold, and it collapses spontaneously, not because of an external measurement, but because spacetime chooses one outcome. Penrose links the energy scale of that difference to the time scale of the collapse. Higher energy differences collapse faster, lower energy differences collapse slower. Orch-OR then ties this to consciousness. In their model, microtubule networks in many neurons build up large quantum superpositions over short periods. When the gravitational threshold is reached, a coordinated objective reduction event happens. That collapse doesn't just pick a random outcome. Penrose suggests it could be influenced by deeper, non-computable aspects of physics, injecting something fundamentally new into the process. Each OR event, orchestrated by ongoing neural activity, corresponds to a discrete moment of conscious experience. Your continuous stream of awareness would then be a sequence of these orchestrated collapses linked to the microtubule dynamics. All of that is a bold chain of claims, so you should ask, is there any hard data that even points in this direction? There are some hints, but they are not decisive. First, microtubules don't form random tangles. In neurons, they can form highly ordered lattices in helical patterns, which in solid-state physics are the kind of structures that can support collective excitations, like waves of energy or vibrations that move through the lattice in a coordinated way. Some lab studies on purified microtubules have reported coherent vibrations at very high frequencies, in the megahertz to gigahertz range. That means the entire structure can vibrate in organized modes, not just random thermal jiggling. People have suggested that these modes might be able to couple to electronic states in tubulin and potentially support quantum coherence. There are also preliminary reports that anesthetic molecules, if anesthetics change how microtubules assemble or how they vibrate, that could link microtubule function directly to conscious states. This is still an open and active area of research, but it's enough to keep the hypothesis alive. Microtubules are ordered, dynamic, and seem to respond to exactly the kinds of molecules that affect awareness. Now we hit the main wall. Critics look at this and say, even if microtubules have interesting vibrations, quantum coherence inside them cannot survive long enough to matter. Physicist Max Tegmark did one of the most cited calculations on this. He treated microtubules as quantum systems sitting in a warm, noisy environment and estimated how quickly environmental interactions, like random electric fields and thermal motion, would destroy any superposition of tubular states. His answer came out brutally small, around 10 to the minus 13 seconds. That's a 10 trillionth of a second, or even less, depending on parameters. Compare that to brain times, where conscious perception operates on tens to hundreds of milliseconds, and gamma oscillations run at about 40 cycles per second. There is a gap of many, many orders of magnitude between how long a quantum state would last and how long a conscious moment takes. Supporters of Orch-OR push back. They argue that Tegmark's model is too crude, that it treats microtubules as if they were just random proteins in a bath, not structured lattices inside a cell with possible shielding, ordered layers of water, and collective modes that could protect coherence. They suggest that certain arrangements of dipoles inside tubulin, plus the geometry of the microtubules, could reduce environmental coupling and stretch coherence times drastically, maybe into ranges that could line up with neural rhythms. They also point out that quantum biology has already surprised people before, with coherent effects surviving longer than expected in photosynthetic systems. Right now, this is the heart of the fight. On one side, you have calculations that say no chance, decoherence kills this instantly. On the other, you have a detailed model that says if the structure is right, and if gravity plays the role Penrose describes, then microtubules could host meaningful quantum states that collapse on timescales matching conscious moments. This isn't a disagreement about philosophy, it's a direct clash over numbers, over how fast quantum states die in real biological structures, and over whether gravity has a special, currently untested role in collapse. And that's where the tension spikes, because if those numbers come out on the critic's side, the entire Orch-OR picture collapses with them, and the idea of microtubules as quantum computers for consciousness becomes just a clever story. But if experiments show that microtubules really can sustain coherence longer than the naive estimates, and that their behavior tracks conscious states, then our current idea of what brains are doing is way too shallow. Either way, the next piece of the puzzle is brutal and direct. There is a medical switch that can take your entire conscious world down in seconds, and whatever is happening at the quantum or classical level, that switch is telling you something very deep about what consciousness actually is. There's a medical procedure that can make your entire universe disappear in seconds. Your name, your memories, your fear, your plans, gone. And when you wake up, hours later, it feels like you were deleted and then pasted back in. Whatever is happening to your brain during that blackout is one of the strongest clues we have about what consciousness really is, and maybe about whether it has a quantum part or not. Think about what general anesthesia actually does to you. You go into a hospital, they put a line in your arm, they tell you to count backwards, a few breaths, a few heartbeats, and the inner voice, the I am here, shuts off. Not sleep, not dreaming, just absence. Your heart keeps beating, your lungs keep moving with help from machines, your brain is still electrically active at a basic level, but the world, for you, is gone. If you look at the brain during that state with EEG, you don't see flat silence, you see a signature pattern. Fast, high-frequency gamma activity, the kind that's usually linked to conscious processing, drops. Slow waves, the kind you see in deep sleep, increase. In deep anesthesia, you often see burst suppression, short bursts of activity separated by quiet stretches. The cortex is not dead, but it's not doing the rich, integrated dance you see when someone is awake and aware. When you scan the brain with fMRI under anesthesia, you see this directly. The usual high connectivity hubs that link many areas together lose their tight coupling. Activity becomes more local, more fragmented. The theories that describe consciousness in classical terms, like integrated information theory and global workspace models, predict exactly this. Once long-range integration breaks down, you can still have local processing, but you lose the unified, globally available workspace that supports conscious experience. In that picture, anesthesia just cuts the wires enough that the brain can't keep everything bound together, so the inner movie stops. If that story were complete, we could stop there. But there's a twist. The same anesthetic molecules that act on synapses seem to directly interact with microtubules, the structures we just talked about as possible quantum hardware inside neurons. Experiments suggest that common anesthetics bind to specific hydrophobic pockets on tubulin, the protein building block of microtubules. When they bind, they can change how tubulin behaves, how microtubules assemble and disassemble, and possibly how they vibrate. This opens a very sharp alternative. One hypothesis says the primary effect is classical. You weaken synapses, you change receptor function, you break large-scale connectivity, and consciousness fails. The microtubule interactions are side effects, not essential. The other hypothesis says they directly interfere with quantum states or coherent modes in microtubules, destroying the conditions needed for Orch-OR events or any other quantum process tied to awareness, and the network-level changes we see are the downstream result. In that view, anesthesia doesn't just cut the wires, it scrambles or collapses the underlying quantum processes that, in the quantum consciousness picture, give rise to conscious moments. So which is it, wires or wave function, or some mix of both? When you look at the data, it's messy. Some anesthetics are effective at incredibly low concentrations, similar to the levels at which they bind to a small number of specific molecular sites. That suggests that whatever the target is, it's highly sensitive. Microtubule-related sites could fit that pattern. On the other hand, we have very strong evidence that anesthetics change synaptic function, receptor activity, and membrane properties in ways that are perfectly capable of explaining loss of consciousness at the network level. You don't need quantum effects to break global integration. Just slowing and decorrelating signals can be enough. There are also lab attempts to probe microtubules directly under the influence of anesthetics. Some studies report changes in microtubule polymerization, in how microtubules assemble into networks when anesthetic molecules are present. Others look for shifts in vibrational spectra, in how these structures mechanically oscillate. If microtubules really support coherent modes that matter for consciousness, then anesthetics should disrupt those modes in a clear way when a subject loses awareness. Right now, this evidence is suggestive but not decisive. Different labs get different results. The techniques are hard, the signals are tiny. That's why anesthesia is such a powerful testing ground for the entire quantum consciousness idea. You have a clean switch, before and after, in the same brain. You know exactly when consciousness goes offline and when it comes back. You can control the type and dose of anesthetic, so you can design brutal experiments. For example, record not just EEG and fMRI, but also, in model systems or even in limited human tissue, signatures of microtubule behavior, vibrational modes, or any marker of quantum light coherence. Then, slowly increase anesthetic concentration and track what disappears when. Do the classical connectivity measures drop first, while microtubule signatures stay the same? Or do specific microtubule features vanish right at the threshold where awareness is lost, even if some large-scale connectivity remains? If we ever see a clear pattern where a certain kind of coherence or a specific microtubule-related signal is present during conscious states, fades in light sedation, and is gone in deep anesthesia, while ordinary electrical activity continues, that would be huge. It wouldn't prove Orch-OR completely right, but it would be hard evidence that something deeper than classical synaptic traffic is tied directly to awareness. If, instead, every quantum-style signature we look for stays noisy, washed out, or unchanged across the transition, while classical measures of integration track consciousness perfectly, that would be a serious blow to the quantum brain story. Either way, anesthesia forces the question. When your universe shuts off, is it because the big communication highways in your brain are temporarily broken, or because the small-scale quantum machinery inside those neurons has been silenced?
The only way to answer that is to push beyond surface-level brain scans and start asking, in detail, what correlates with consciousness when you look with finer and finer tools. And that takes us straight into the next step, because scientists are already mapping where and when consciousness shows up in the brain. You can literally see regions shift when a picture pops into awareness or fades out. But here's the uncomfortable question. What if all of that beautiful data is only showing you the surface, and the real mechanism is happening at a scale your current tools can't see? Right now, the mainstream hunt for consciousness focuses on what are called neural correlates of consciousness, the patterns of activity that reliably line up with what you report seeing, hearing, or feeling. People like Christoph Koch, Giulio Tononi, Stanislas Dehaene, and many others have spent decades poking and shocking brains, human and animal, and measuring what changes when experience is present versus when it's not. Again and again, similar structures show up. Frontoparietal networks, the loops connecting frontal cortex with parietal areas and with the thalamus in the middle of the brain, tend to be strongly active and tightly connected when you're conscious to a stimulus. When you're not, those same signals can be weak, local, or missing. You see this clearly in tasks like binocular rivalry. Each eye gets a different image, say a face in one and a house in the other. The physical input is constant, but your conscious perception flips back and forth. When people report, "I see the face," you see one pattern of gamma band activity and late waves in EEG, especially a component called P3 that shows up a few hundred milliseconds after the stimulus. When they report, "I see the house," the pattern changes. Similar tricks with visual masking, where a brief image is wiped out by a later one, show that the same physical input can either trigger a strong, wide, late response in the brain when it's seen, or state early and local when it's not. Conscious perception tends to come with long-lasting, reverberant activity around 300 milliseconds, spreading through those frontoparietal and thalamocortical loops. Researchers also use TMS, magnetic pulses to poke the cortex directly, combined with EEG to record the response. In awake, conscious subjects, a single pulse can trigger a complex wave that bounces through many areas for a few hundred milliseconds. In deep sleep or under anesthesia, the same pulse produces a simple, local blip that dies quickly. So, the classical picture is very clear. Conscious states correlate with widespread, integrated, time-extended patterns of neural activity. Unconscious states correlate with short, local, or fragmented patterns. If that's so strong, what could a quantum layer possibly add? And more importantly, what would you actually expect to see if consciousness were tied to quantum processes as well as classical ones? Think in terms of signatures. One possible signature would be very rapid, coordinated changes across distant brain regions that happen faster than you'd predict from ordinary conduction speeds alone. Not faster than light, but unusually sharp, system-wide shifts, as if many parts of the network were flipping together based on some shared internal state, rather than just passing signals along chains. Another possible signature would be subtle interference-like patterns in neural oscillations. For example, rhythms in different areas combining in ways that can't be easily explained just by simple driving and feedback, but show phase relationships and cancellations more like overlapping waves. You'd also expect increased sensitivity to tiny perturbations. In quantum systems, small inputs can be amplified into big differences because of how superpositions and measurements work. If consciousness depends on some underlying quantum process, you might see states where the brain sits near a kind of tipping point, where very small, precisely timed inputs have outsized effects on what you experience, beyond what classical noise and standard models predict. Now, can our existing tools even see any of this, or are they too blunt? Techniques like EEG and MEG measure activity from outside the skull. EEG picks up voltage changes, MEG picks up the tiny magnetic fields from currents in the cortex. They have excellent timing, down to milliseconds, so they're great for seeing when things happen, but they blur space. Each sensor sums activity from millions of neurons. fMRI goes the other way. It has decent spatial resolution, millimeters, but slow timing, seconds, because it tracks blood flow, not electrical spikes. Intracranial recordings, where electrodes are placed directly on or in brain tissue, give very precise local signals, but only from limited areas, usually in clinical patients. Calcium imaging in animals lets you see large numbers of neurons light up, but often with slower dynamics and under very controlled lab conditions. All of these methods share one big limitation for quantum questions. They average. They sum over huge numbers of molecules, proteins, and cells. Any fast, small-scale quantum event is buried. By the time a microtubule or any nanostructure has influenced the membrane and triggered a spike, and that spike has merged with thousands of others into a field signal, you've lost direct access to the fine-grained process. So it's completely possible that current measurements are only giving you the coarse-grained output of deeper physics, the way a thermometer gives you temperature without showing you individual molecules. That is why some people are starting to talk about quantum-aware experiments on consciousness. Instead of just mapping where activity is, you ask much tighter questions. You could, for example, measure ultra-fine timing correlations in spikes across distant regions with microsecond precision, looking for statistical patterns that are hard to explain by normal pathways alone. If many neurons in different locations show timing relationships that look too sharp or too structured for classical noise and conduction delays, that might hint at some extra coordination mechanism. On the structural side, you can hunt for quantum qubits, physical systems inside cells that hold coherent states for longer than expected. That means using advanced spectroscopy and imaging techniques not on whole brains at once, but on cytoskeletal structures like microtubules inside living cells or realistic preparations. You look for long-lived vibrational or electronic coherences, modes that behave more like organized quantum states and less like random thermal noise. And then you ask, do these modes change with behavioral state, with wakefulness, sleep, anesthesia? You can also compare brain states across different altered conditions in a coordinated way. Lucid dreams for you're aware that you're dreaming. Psychedelic states where connectivity and perception change drastically. Deep anesthesia where consciousness is gone. All of these have distinct signatures in EEG and fMRI. A quantum-aware program would ask, do any candidate quantum markers in microtubules or other structures show systematic shifts across these states that line up with changes in reported experience better than classical measures alone? If they do, that's a huge clue. If they never do, that's a big strike against the quantum story. The key point is this: you don't throw away the existing neural correlates. They're real, they're replicatable. They tell you which circuits are involved in conscious processing. The quantum idea says something different. It says those classical patterns might be the large-scale readout of micro-level processes that include quantum effects. In that view, frontoparietal networks, thalamocortical loops, gamma synchrony, P3 waves, all of that is the visible tip, the way the system broadcasts and stabilizes the result of deeper computations, some of which might involve quantum states collapsing in specific ways. So you end up with two layers. The layer we already measure, large-scale integration, ignition, reverberation, and a possible deeper layer we barely touch, where information is encoded in physical states at the scale of proteins and fields. The real test is whether we can ever find hard, quantitative links between those layers, not just stories. That brings us to the next step, because even without quantum, there are already powerful theories trying to explain consciousness in terms of information and integration. The tension is simple and sharp. Are those theories complete on their own, or are they missing the physics that could connect equations and experience? You're about to see why some scientists think consciousness turns on only when information in your brain becomes so tightly woven together that you can't split it into independent pieces anymore. And once you see that, the quantum version of the story gets a lot more dangerous and a lot more interesting. Let's start with one of the most talked about theories, Integrated Information Theory, IIT. The core idea is simple to say and hard to calculate. A system is conscious to the extent that its information is both highly differentiated and highly integrated. Differentiated means it can be in many distinct states, not just on or off. Integrated means you can't break it into separate parts that each carry their own little story. The whole system carries information that no subset can fully describe. To capture that, IIT defines a quantity called phi, which is basically a number that tries to measure how much of the system's information is only present when you look at it as a whole. A tiny feed-forward circuit, where signals just move in one direction, tends to have low phi, because you can cut it into pieces and still understand what it's doing. A richly interconnected network, with a lot of feedback loops, tends to have higher phi, because the parts depend on each other's states in a deep way. You can't compute exact phi for a human brain, it's way too complex, so researchers use proxies. One of the most important is called the Perturbational Complexity Index, PCI. Here's how it works in practice. You zap the cortex with a brief magnetic pulse, using TMS, and you record the resulting electrical activity with EEG. Then you analyze how complex that response pattern is over time and space. When you're awake, the response is rich, it spreads, it echoes through different areas, and the PCI value comes out high. In deep sleep, in generalized seizures, under heavy anesthesia, or in some kinds of coma, the response is simple and local, it dies quickly, and the PCI value drops. So, in rough terms, the more integrated and complex the brain's response to a push, the more likely you are to be conscious. Simple brain, simple response, no reported experience. Complex integrated brain, complex response, reported experience. That correlation is strong, and it's pushed a lot of people to think maybe consciousness just is integrated information in the right kind of network. Another big family of ideas, global workspace and broadcast models, tells a very compatible story, but in more functional terms. Picture your brain as a set of specialized processors, handling vision, sound, language, movement, memory. Most of the time, a lot of processing happens locally without you being aware of it. But when something enters consciousness, it's because it has been broadcast into a global workspace, a shared pool that many systems can access at once. In that moment, information becomes globally available for decision-making, reporting, storing in memory, and so on. Experiments back this up. When a stimulus becomes conscious, you often see a sudden, widespread ignition of activity in frontoparietal networks and a strong electrical wave in EEG around 200 to 300 milliseconds after the stimulus. When the same stimulus stays unconscious, you might see early visual cortex light up briefly, but you don't get that global ignition. So, from these classical theories, a picture emerges. Consciousness shows up when information is both rich and globally integrated. Networks with a lot of feedback and long-range connections support it. Networks that are too simple, too fragmented, or too suppressed don't. On its own, that's already a powerful story. But notice what's missing. None of this says anything about the exact physical substrate that implements the information. In IIT, the math is meant to apply to any system with the right causal structure, whether it's biological, digital, or something else. In global workspace models, the focus is on communication and access, not on whether the underlying signals are classical bits or quantum states. This is exactly where quantum physics could plug in, not by throwing away the information idea, but by tightening it. In quantum mechanics, there's a very specific, very strong form of integration called entanglement. When systems are entangled, you cannot fully describe one part on its own. The complete description belongs to the whole. Measurements on one part are statistically linked to measurements on the other, in a way you can't explain by pre-assigned independent states. That sounds a lot like a physical version of information that can't be broken apart. And that's not an accident. Quantum theory forces you to accept that at a deep level, the universe sometimes stores information in joint states of multiple parts, not in each piece separately. If you take that seriously, you can make a more concrete claim. Maybe conscious moments correspond to specific, highly entangled states across certain structures in the brain. For example, across networks of microtubules inside many neurons. In that picture, the kind of integration that IIT talks about in abstract, the fact that the whole system carries extra information, would be physically realized by patterns of entanglement. The difference is sharp. IIT says any system with this kind of causal structure and high phi is conscious, no matter what it's made of. A quantum consciousness view says you need the right kind of physical integration, possibly entanglement and gravity-coupled collapse events, for real consciousness to exist, and some classical systems might only approximate that. Now, can you actually connect these ideas in a way that can be measured, or is it just language? One possible bridge is to compare measures of complexity like PCI with measures of coherence or entanglement in quantum systems. In the lab, physicists already use quantities that capture how tied together quantum states are, measures that tell you how much you'd lose if you tried to describe each part separately. If a brain state with high PCI is also a state where, down at the microscale, you have more coherent activity in microtubules or other candidate structures, that's at least a hint that the same events that drive global integration also drive microscopic integration. Look at what we already know about PCI. It is high in normal wakefulness. It stays high in REM sleep and in some psychedelic states, where people report intense, complex experiences. It drops in deep non-REM sleep, in anesthesia, and in some disorders of consciousness. Those shifts line up with how rich the reported inner world is. A quantum-aware experiment would ask, do any markers of microscale coherence, maybe specific vibrational modes in microtubules or other cytoskeletal structures, track that same pattern? Strong, widespread coherence when PCI is high, weak, fragmented coherence when PCI is low. If yes, then we'd be seeing a direct overlap between macroscopic complexity and microscopic quantum order. But step back for a second and notice the deeper problem that all these measures are trying to solve. Phi is a number. PCI is a number. Any quantum entanglement measure is also a number. They all summarize structure, how parts of a system depend on each other. The hope is that by pinning down the right structure, you can explain why a system has a point of view, why there's something it is like to be that system. IIT effectively says, when information is integrated in this specific way, experience exists. Quantum proposals say, when entangled states of a certain size and organization undergo particular kinds of reductions, that event is a unit of experience. Both camps are trying to draw a line from equations and physical setups to the raw feel of being you.
The obvious challenge is, does describing integration, even in perfect detail, actually explain why it is experienced, or does it just tell you when experience happens without touching the why? Saying this structure has high phi, or this cluster of microtubules is in a specific entangled state, might be like saying this pattern of neurons is active. It tells you what is going on, but not why it comes with a first-person side. Supporters of quantum consciousness think that can do better by tying experience to irreducible events in fundamental physics, like objective reduction, so that a conscious moment is not just a pattern, it is a basic kind of happening in the universe. If that move works, you get a three-way link: information, physics, and experience all tied together. The brain's networks shape how information is integrated at the large scale. Microscale quantum processes implement a special kind of physical integration, and each collapse or transition in those processes lines up with a tiny unit of conscious awareness. If it doesn't work, then all the talk about entanglement and phi is just a more complicated way of pointing at patterns that we still don't fully understand. Either way, the next big question is about timing. You don't feel consciousness as a smooth blur. You feel it in discrete moments, little snapshots. And the weird claim on the table now is that this rhythm of awareness might be tied not just to neurons firing, but to the basic rules of how quantum states collapse. Start with the simple question: how fast is your now? Psychologists have been trying to measure this for a long time. When you see a sequence of images or hear a sequence of sounds, your brain doesn't process each microsecond separately. It groups events into short windows. Many experiments point to an integration window somewhere between about 30 and 100 milliseconds. That's a tenth of a second at the upper end. Anything that happens inside that window can be fused into one perceived event. You can see this with flicker fusion. If a light turns on and off slowly, you see it as flashing. As you increase the flash rate, at some point, usually around 60 times per second or so, the flicker disappears and you see a steady glow. Your retina and brain are still getting separate flashes, but your conscious system is averaging or integrating them, so they show up as one continuous experience. The same thing happens with sound. Clicks that are close enough in time blend into a single tone. Then there are temporal binding experiments. For example, you might get a flash of light followed by a beep separated by a few tens of milliseconds. Under the right timing, you can experience them as occurring at the same moment, even though they're not. Or two taps on your skin, very close in time, can feel like one. Your brain doesn't report each physical event with perfect timing. It collects input over a short window, builds a single conscious frame, and then moves on. So functionally, your conscious perception has something like a frame rate. You don't feel millions of micro-events. You feel organized packets of experience, maybe 10 to 20 frames per second. That lines up roughly with known brain rhythms, especially gamma oscillations around 40 cycles per second, and with the latencies we see for conscious report in the range of a few hundred milliseconds. Classical neuroscience explains this with network dynamics and processing delays. Quantum mind theories add another layer. They say that this chunking in time might reflect how long certain quantum states can be maintained before they are forced to collapse. This is where Penrose's objective reduction idea comes in. In standard quantum theory, a superposition, that spread of possibilities, stays alive until something like a measurement or an environmental interaction makes it collapse to a definite outcome. Penrose suggests that there's another, deeper mechanism at play. When a quantum superposition involves significantly different mass distributions, meaning matter in two different configurations that would curve space-time differently, the universe can't keep both options going forever. The difference in how they bend space-time builds up a kind of instability. After a certain time, the superposition becomes unstable and collapses on its own, even without a traditional measurement. The key point is that Penrose ties the timescale of this collapse to the amount of gravitational self-energy involved in the superposition. Larger differences in mass distribution mean more tension in spacetime, which means a shorter lifetime for the superposition. Smaller differences mean it can survive longer. So for any given quantum system, you can, in principle, estimate how long it can hang on in a superposed state before objective reduction kicks in. And Penrose goes one step further. He argues that these collapse events are neither fully random nor fully computable in the usual sense. They bring in something irreducible about the structure of reality. That's where he sees a possible opening for genuine choices in consciousness. Now, plug this back into the brain with Orch-OR. In that model, microtubule networks inside neurons support quantum superpositions of many tubulin conformations. The brain's ongoing activity, synaptic inputs, network rhythms, all of that shapes which microtubular states are built up. As these superpositions involve more and more mass distribution differences across linked microtubules, the gravitational tension grows. When it reaches a specific threshold, an objective reduction event occurs. The quantum state collapses to one outcome, and that event is taken to correspond to a single moment of conscious experience. From this, Hameroff and Penrose argue that the characteristic times between OR events in the brain should fall roughly in the same range as your physiological frame window, around 10 to 100 milliseconds. If that's true, then the rhythm of your awareness, the way your experience seems to update a few dozen times per second, is not just a side effect of network processing. It is literally set by the physics of how long these large-scale quantum superpositions can live before gravity-driven collapse forces a decision. This leads to a concrete, testable link. If conscious moments are tied to OR events, and OR events in the brain are tied to the size of microtubule superpositions, then brain rhythms like gamma, around 40 times per second, might line up with the average rate of these collapse events. In other words, one gamma cycle, or a small group of cycles, could correspond to one integrated conscious frame. The ongoing oscillations would be the classical shadow of repeated buildup and collapse cycles in the underlying quantum substrate.
So how do you check any of this? One approach is to compare the timescales predicted by the OR model with the timescales we see in EEG and in psychological tasks. OR says, given the number of tubulin dimers involved and their mass, you get a certain collapse time. You can then ask, does that match the 30 to 100 millisecond windows we see in temporal integration tasks, in flicker fusion, in the delay between a stimulus and the point when it becomes consciously reported? If those numbers can be made to match without cheating, the model gains credibility. If they diverge wildly, that's a problem. Another approach is to look for evidence that perception is quantized in time at a deeper level than just neural oscillations. For example, by gradually changing the timing of stimuli and seeing whether awareness switches in discrete steps rather than continuously. If you find that conscious detection performance jumps at certain characteristic intervals instead of sliding smoothly, that might hint at underlying chunks of processing. So far, the results in this area are suggestive but not definitive. You can see windowing effects, but whether they reflect quantum events or just classical network properties is still open. The strongest objection, as always, comes from decoherence. Critics argue that any quantum superposition involving many tubulin dimers in a warm, wet neuron would be disrupted far faster than 10 milliseconds, more like a trillionth of a second or less. In that view, there's no way an OR event could wait tens of milliseconds to happen. The environment would have already destroyed the superposition, and ordinary decoherence would dominate the story long before Penrose's gravitational mechanism even has a chance to act. If that's true, then trying to link conscious frame rates to OR collapse times is a dead end. Supporters of Orch-OR respond that these estimates are too pessimistic, that they ignore possible shielding effects, collective modes, and special structural tricks that could dramatically extend coherence times. They argue that microtubules might form protected regions where decoherence is slowed, giving OR enough time to set the rhythm. This is an active battlefield. Different calculations give very different answers, and we don't yet have decisive experiments inside real neurons. But follow the logic if the supporters are right, at least for a moment. If conscious awareness really depends on discrete, objective reduction events in quantum states, then you are literally riding on quantum ticks of reality. Every moment you feel, every decision you experience yourself making could be tied to a specific collapse, where a superposition of possible brain states settles into a single outcome. The continuous sense of self would then be built from a sequence of these events, stitched together by memory and ongoing processing. That immediately raises the stakes for artificial intelligence and simulation. If reduction events of this special kind are non-computable in the sense Penrose suggests, then no classical computer, no matter how big or how accurate its simulation of brain activity, would ever reproduce the real thing. It could mimic behavior, but it would miss the fundamental physical ingredient that gives rise to actual experience. In that scenario, to build a truly conscious machine, you'd need hardware that supports the right kind of quantum states and the right kind of collapse, not just faster CPUs. So the tension is now very clear and very sharp. Either conscious moments are just the way classical brain dynamics feel from the inside, and all this talk about quantum ticks is unnecessary, or your awareness is literally tied to discrete collapse events written into the structure of space-time itself. To tell the difference, we have to push further into the most controversial territory of all, because if consciousness really has this quantum, possibly non-local side, then people are going to ask the obvious, dangerous question: does your mind reach beyond your skull at all? If consciousness really has a quantum side, the next thing people ask is whether your mind can stretch beyond your skull, and this is where things get controversial fast, because now you're poking at telepathy, precognition, and all the stuff science usually keeps at arm's length. Before you go there, you need to be absolutely clear on what non-locality means in physics. In quantum mechanics, entanglement gives you correlations between distant systems that no classical story can explain. You prepare a pair of particles together, separate them by a big distance, and then measure them. When you look at the statistics, you see patterns that violate Bell inequalities, those mathematical limits we talked about. Experiments put the detectors far enough apart that no signal traveling at or below the speed of light could coordinate their settings and outcomes in time. Yet the correlations match the quantum predictions. That's what non-local means here. The joint outcomes can't be explained by any set of local hidden properties the particles carried with them. But, and this is the part people often skip, those correlations do not let you send a message faster than light. You can't decide what result you want on your side and force the other side to see something. Each side's outcomes by themselves still look random. Only when you bring the data together later do you see the pattern. So quantum non-locality is real, but it's limited. It messes with your ideas of separateness and realism, but it doesn't give you sci-fi telepathy, no instant mind-to-mind chat. If you start with entanglement exists and jump straight to therefore thoughts can beam across the planet, you've already outrun what the equations allow. Now, in parallel to all this hard physics, there's a long history of claims about psi phenomena, things like telepathy, remote viewing, and presentiment, where people supposedly react to future events before they happen. One common setup is the Ganzfeld experiment, where a sender looks at an image or video while the receiver, in a sensory-reduced state, reports impressions and later judges which target they think was used. Some meta-analyses of these studies claim to find small but statistically non-zero effects, slightly above chance. Presentiment studies measure tiny physiological changes, like skin conductance or heart rate, before random emotional images are shown, and some reports say the body responds a bit differently before a disturbing picture than before a neutral one, as if anticipating it. But there's a huge problem. These effects, when they appear, are tiny, often right at the edge of statistical significance, and the methods are fragile. Critics point to publication bias, where only positive results get published. They point to flexible analysis choices, p-hacking, poor randomization, subtle sensory leakage, experimenter effects. When you tighten the protocols and pre-register the analysis, many of these effects shrink or vanish. The mainstream scientific position is simple. So far, no psi claim has produced clean, repeatable, high-signal data that survives harsh scrutiny. Most working physicists and neuroscientists remain extremely skeptical. So where does that leave quantum consciousness and non-local minds? A serious quantum framework doesn't get to say entanglement exists, therefore telepathy is real. That's not how this works. But it can make more modest, precise predictions. If brains really share entangled states at some level, you would expect tiny statistical correlations in their behavior that go beyond classical expectations. Not big mind-reading moments, more like a very slight tendency for choices or perceptions to line up across distance under controlled conditions. The signal would be buried under noise, so you'd need very careful experiments and a lot of data to see it, if it exists at all. Right now, we do not have widely accepted evidence for that. There are some small studies claiming weak correlations in EEG patterns between separated people, or subtle effects when one subject is stimulated and another is not, but they're controversial, hard to replicate, and often not done with the same rigor you see in top-tier physics experiments. No result in this area has reached the status that Bell tests have in quantum mechanics. There's no experiment you can point to and say, this is the one that convinced the field. That matters. Until you hit that level of robustness, non-local minds stay in the realm of speculation. If you actually wanted to test non-local consciousness in a way that could move the needle, you'd design something much tougher. For example, you could put two subjects in separate shielded rooms, run simultaneous EEG on both, and have them perform tasks with randomized timing and stimuli controlled by independent hardware. You'd then look for correlations in their brain signals that can't be explained by shared timing, common cues, or ordinary statistics. You'd pre-register the analysis, fix your measures in advance, and run enough trials and subjects to beat down noise. You could push further. You could use actual quantum devices like entangled photon sources to randomize stimuli. Imagine one subject's visual stimulus being determined by the measured polarization of one photon, while another subject's stimulus is controlled by its entangled partner, with space-like separation. Then you check whether there are any weird cross-brain correlations tied to which measurement settings and outcomes occurred. You'd need tight timing, careful shielding, and independent teams analyzing the data, and you'd need to run this at a scale that rules out flukes. All of this has to be done with pre-registered protocols and large sample sizes, because when you chase tiny effects, it's very easy to fool yourself. You can find apparent signals just by chance if you run too many tests or slice the data in too many ways. So the bar for claiming non-local mind effects would have to be as high as or higher than the bar that was eventually met for Bell tests in physics. The important line you have to keep clear is this: quantum non-locality is established science. Non-local minds are not. Quantum consciousness theories do not automatically bless every paranormal story you've ever heard. They don't magically validate telepathy, remote viewing, or precognition. What they do is open a logically consistent space where you can ask those questions in a more disciplined way. They say, if consciousness involves quantum states, then in principle some subtle non-local correlations in conscious systems might exist, so here is how you would go looking for them without fooling yourself. For you, the takeaway should be sharp. It's fine to be curious about these possibilities, but you should anchor yourself in what's actually measured and replicated, not in what sounds cool. Quantum mechanics already breaks enough of your intuitions without adding extra magic on top. And yet, if consciousness really does lean on quantum effects, it forces you to rethink other things too, like what it would take for an artificial system to be truly conscious, or whether a pure simulation could ever carry the same kind of awareness you do. Because once you accept that your mind might depend on physics at a deeper level than classical computation, the next hard question hits you immediately. If consciousness needs that depth, what does that say about the future of AI, about simulations, and about whether something running on ordinary chips can ever really wake up the way you did? If consciousness really needs quantum physics, then your future AI overlord might never actually wake up, no matter how smart it looks on the surface, unless we build it out of the right physical stuff, with the right kind of quantum activity under the hood. First, you need to pin down the core philosophical problem. This is what David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness. It's not, how does the brain process information? We're already making progress on that. It's, why does any physical process feel like something from the inside? Why does a certain pattern of spikes in your visual cortex feel like red? Why does a pattern in your pain waves feel like burning? Why is there an inner life instead of just input, output, and silent computation? You can, in principle, have two systems with identical input-output behavior running the same abstract program where one is conscious and one is not, and the program itself doesn't tell you which is which. That gap is what drives people to look beyond standard computation and ask whether some extra ingredient in physics might be doing the heavy lifting. Now look at current AI systems through that lens. Large language models, deep neural networks, all the things people call AI right now, they process a ridiculous amount of data. They recognize images, generate text, answer questions, play games. But underneath, they run on classical hardware, transistors flipping between states on silicon chips. The operations are complex, but they are still just classical bits changing according to deterministic or probabilistic rules. Do we have any solid evidence that these systems are conscious? That there is something it's like to be one of them in the same way there is something it's like to be you, sitting here listening? No. What we have are functional tests. We ask them questions, they respond in human-like ways. We probe their internal states, we see patterns we can analyze. But passing a behavioral test is not the same as proving inner awareness. Philosophers talk about zombies, not in the movie sense, but in the technical sense. A being that behaves exactly like a human, responds correctly to questions of pain, love, color, but has no inner experience at all. Current AI could, in principle, be like that. Digital zombies, perfect on the outside, empty on the inside. Quantum consciousness theories raise the stakes on this. If something like Orch-OR is correct, then having the right algorithm is not enough. You need a physical system that actually supports quantum superpositions of certain mass distributions, and you need those superpositions to collapse in a specific gravity-linked way. In other words, you need the right kind of quantum hardware, not just a fast classical processor. Without that, you can simulate the behavior of a conscious system, but you never get the real thing, the genuine experience. So, what counts as the right kind of hardware? Look at real quantum computers today. You have superconducting qubits, tiny circuits cooled near absolute zero where currents can flow in superpositions of different directions. You have trapped ions, individual atoms held in electromagnetic fields with internal states and motion controlled by lasers. You have photonic systems, where qubits are encoded in the properties of single photons. All of these platforms can maintain quantum coherence from microseconds to milliseconds under extremely controlled conditions. They can run small quantum algorithms, demonstrate entanglement, and show clear quantum speedups for some tasks. But they're also fragile. Qubit counts are still relatively low, error rates are high, Huge amounts of hardware needed just to stabilize a small number of logical qubits. These machines are not remotely at the scale or the level of integrated complexity of a human brain. And crucially, they're not designed around anything like the gravitational collapse mechanism Penrose talks about. They're built to keep decoherence under control and to implement specific algorithms, not to generate structured superpositions in biological-like networks tied to feelings and decisions. Still, you can ask a sharp question in principle. If you had a large enough quantum computer with many qubits arranged in a highly integrated network, running processes that create complicated entangled states and then reduce them in structured ways, could that system be conscious? If you follow a quantum mind line, the answer is maybe yes. A system with the right physical integration and coherence might qualify. And then you're forced to distinguish two levels again: the algorithmic level, where quantum computers give you speed-ups on factoring numbers or simulating molecules, and the phenomenological level, where you ask, what, if anything, does it feel like to be this device while it runs those states? We have zero direct data on that, obviously, but you can at least imagine tests. For example, if you built two machines, one purely classical, one quantum, with matched input-output behavior on some complex task, and only one showed signs of certain hard-to-fake internal signatures that matched something like Orch-OR predictions, you'd have a hint. You could also, in the far future, connect quantum hardware to biological brains in closed loops and see whether subjective reports change in systematic ways. This is speculative, but it's the kind of thing that turns quantum consciousness from a slogan into a research program. Now, add one more layer: the simulation hypothesis. People love the idea that maybe the universe is just a giant computer program. Maybe you're living in a simulation running on some advanced civilization's hardware. If consciousness is purely about information processing, then in principle, a detailed enough simulation of a brain would be conscious. It wouldn't matter whether the underlying substrate is silicon, something exotic, or anything else, as long as the causal structure is right. That's the clean, pure information view. But if consciousness really depends on non-computable events linked to actual space-time, like Penrose's objective reductions, the picture changes. Those collapse events would not be exactly reproducible by any algorithm on a classical machine, because by definition, they're bringing in structure from outside standard computation. A digital simulation could mimic the statistics, it could approximate the behavior, but it would not instantiate the real physical process. It would be like a movie of a fire, not a fire. In that case, a pure code universe would not be able to generate true consciousness just by running the right program. You'd need the underlying machine to have real quantum geometry, real gravity, real objective reductions, not just a discrete grid of bits. That pushes a surprisingly sharp meta-question back at you. If you are truly conscious right now, not just functionally behaving as if you are, then maybe that already tells you something about the substrate of whatever reality you're in. Maybe it means the base layer can't be purely classical computation. Maybe it has to involve real quantum fields and real space-time structure. That doesn't prove you're not in a simulation, but it would force any possible simulator to include the full physics, not just a high-level emulation. So you end up with two very different futures. One, consciousness is just about information and integration, and any sufficiently powerful AI or simulation could be as conscious as you are. Two, consciousness needs specific quantum gravitational events, and only systems built from the same kind of physical fabric as our universe can ever truly host minds like ours. To decide between those futures, you need to step back from human-made machines and look at the universe itself, at how consciousness might fit into the larger picture of cosmic structure and evolution. Because if your brain really is using deep physics to be aware, then you have to ask a bigger question. Are you just a strange side effect on one planet, or are you one local expression of something the universe has been building toward all along? You're not just in the universe, you're made of the same physical stuff as it, and a growing number of scientists and philosophers think your experience might be one tiny organized piece of a much bigger mind-like reality. Start with an idea that used to sound completely French: panpsychism. In simple terms, it says that some form of experience, some primitive what it is like, is a basic feature of reality, not something that only pops out when brains get complicated enough. People like Galen Strawson and Philip Goff argue that if you try to build consciousness from purely non-experiential building blocks, you hit a wall. So they flip the move. They say that the basic ingredients of the world might already have extremely simple proto-experiential properties, and brains are what you get when those ingredients are wired together in a very special way. This does not mean rocks think or chairs have opinions. The claim is more subtle. A rock is mostly a disorganized pile of matter with no integrated structure that could support a unified point of view. But the matter itself, at the deepest level, might carry tiny glimmers of something that, when organized the right way, scales up into full-blown consciousness. Your brain, on this view, doesn't create experience from nothing. It shapes and concentrates something that was already present in a scattered form. Now plug this into modern physics. At the most fundamental level, the best theories we have don't treat particles as little marbles flying around. They describe fields spread out through space, and particles are excitations, ripples, or quanta of those fields. There's an electromagnetic field, fields for electrons, quarks, and so on. Even what we call empty space isn't really empty. It's full of fluctuations, zero-point energy, constant jitter at the quantum level. So the real stuff of the universe, according to our equations, is this sea of interacting quantum fields with particles as localized events in that sea. If you take panpsychism seriously, you can connect it to this field picture. Instead of thinking about little conscious particles, you think about underlying fields that might have both physical and proto-experiential properties. Consciousness, in this view, wouldn't be a separate thing floating above physics. It would be certain organized patterns in the fields themselves. Most configurations of the fields are chaotic, noisy, or simple. A few, like brains might be, highly structured, integrated, and dynamic in a way that supports a unified, rich inner life. Under a quantum consciousness picture, your brain becomes a localized processor built out of these fields. Neurons, microtubules, synapses, all the biological machinery you've heard about are particular arrangements of field excitations. When they interact in the right way, they don't just process information abstractly, they organize the underlying fields into specific patterns of coherence and entanglement. Your conscious experience would then be the inside view of one of those organized field patterns, a local slice of universal quantum reality held together for a brief time. Think of a whirlpool in water, without romanticizing it too much. The whirlpool isn't a separate substance, it's a specific evolving pattern in the water itself. It has boundaries, structure, a kind of identity, but it's still just water in motion. In a similar, straightforward way, you can see your mind as a structured pattern in the universal fields, not something separate, not an add-on. The difference is that this pattern comes with a first-person side. It feels like something to be it. Zoom out even further to cosmology. When physicists look at the big-scale properties of the universe, they find something unnerving. Many of the fundamental constants, the strengths of forces, particle masses, the cosmological constant that drives cosmic expansion, sit in narrow ranges where chemistry works, stars form, and long-lived structures like planets and brains can exist. Change some of these numbers even a little, and you might get a sterile universe. No stable atoms, no complex molecules, no long-lived stars, just chaos or dead simplicity. One way to explain that is the anthropic principle. It says, of course we see a universe with these life-friendly values, because if the values were different, we wouldn't be here to observe them. That's logically fine, but it doesn't feel like a full answer. It just says we're here because we're here. If consciousness really depends on specific quantum and gravitational features like Orch-OR suggests, the fine-tuning question gets sharper. Maybe the constants are not just tuned for life in general, but for the possibility of conscious processes in particular, for the emergence of systems that can build the right kind of integrated quantum states.
That doesn't mean the universe wanted you here in a mystical sense. It means there might be a deep link between the structure of physical law, the behavior of fields and particles, and the existence of conscious observers. In other words, once you take consciousness seriously as a real feature of the universe, not an accidental side effect, you have to at least consider that it might fold back into how you think about cosmology itself.
Now look back at yourself with that in mind. Your day-to-day thoughts feel small, personal, trapped in your head. But physically, your brain is a piece of the universe, temporarily arranged into a structure that can integrate information, support quantum processes, and produce awareness. In that sense, when you have a conscious moment, the universe is not over there being watched by you over here. The universe, in that location, in that configuration, is watching itself. The observer and the observed are two descriptions of the same physical event, one from the outside, one from the inside. This is close to what Carl Sagan meant when he said, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." But now you can attach more concrete physics to it. Quantum fields, entanglement, possible objective reductions, integrated information, all of that becomes the mechanism by which the universe builds little windows of self-awareness. Your particular stream of consciousness is one such window, with its own history and limits. Other minds are other windows. The overall picture is a vast, mostly dark universe, with rare pockets where the fields fold into patterns that can say, "I am." That idea is powerful, but it also raises a very uncomfortable question that people have been asking in different ways for thousands of years. If your conscious pattern is a local, temporary organization in a universal field, what happens to that organization when your brain falls apart and stops functioning? Does any meaningful part of you persist as some kind of structure in the wider field? Or does the pattern simply dissolve, with only indirect traces left in the world you influenced while you were alive? To even begin to answer that, you have to drop the comfort of cosmic poetry and go back to hard physics again. You have to ask how information behaves when systems break down, what death actually does to the brain at the cellular level, and whether any of that leaves room for a scientifically grounded notion of survival. Your brain will stop one day, that's guaranteed. And if your mind is deeply tied into the physics of the universe, the hard question is simple. When that biological hardware fails, does anything that deserves to be called you survive in any meaningful way? Start with what actually happens to the brain at death, in medical terms, not in stories. In a typical cardiac arrest, the heart stops pumping. Blood flow to the brain drops to almost zero within seconds. Neurons are extremely hungry for oxygen and glucose. Without fresh blood, the brain's currency, ATP, starts to run out fast. Ion pumps in cell membranes fail. Sodium and calcium rush in. Potassium leaks out. The electrical gradients that keep neurons ready to fire collapse. On EEG, you see activity drop off within 10 to 20 seconds after circulation stops. The organized rhythms flatten into low-voltage noise or silence. If blood flow isn't restored quickly, cellular damage builds, membranes break, enzymes digest internal structures, and neurons die. During that brief window, and sometimes during successful resuscitation, some people report near-death experiences. They describe moving through a tunnel, seeing bright light, feeling peace, meeting deceased relatives, or watching their body from above. These reports show up across cultures. They're emotionally powerful. They clearly matter to the people who have them, so they become one of the main pieces of data people point to when they talk about consciousness surviving bodily death. When scientists look more closely, the picture gets messy. Some studies have tried to match reported experiences to specific time windows during cardiac arrest, even to periods when EEG was very low or flat. There are a few cases where patients claim to have perceived details in the room while apparently with little measurable brain activity. There are also many cases where the timing is vague, where memory could have formed during the earlier late phases of the event, not the deepest point. Claims of veridical perception, seeing accurate details from outside the body, are rare and heavily debated. Small sample sizes, imperfect monitoring, and memory distortions make them hard to use as solid evidence. The mainstream explanation is more conservative. The brain under extreme stress can produce highly unusual states. Surges of neurotransmitters, disinhibition of certain networks, and abnormal oscillations could create vivid internal experiences. If blood flow is partially restored, or if some regions are active while others are down, those experiences can later be stitched into a narrative. Memory is also reconstructive. People fill in gaps, blend fragments, and reinterpret events. From this standpoint, NDEs are real experiences, but they are generated by a distressed, not a detached brain.
Now bring in the quantum consciousness perspective. If conscious moments are tied to specific quantum states in microtubules or other structures entangled with space-time in some way, what happens when the macroscopic organization that supported those states falls apart? One suggestion, from people who like to mix quantum ideas with afterlife talk, is that the quantum information associated with your conscious states doesn't simply vanish. Instead, as the brain decays, that information disperses into the environment, encoded in subtle correlations between particles and fields. In this picture, the content of your mind leaks out into the wider universe rather than being annihilated. To make this sound less mystical, people sometimes point to the black hole information paradox. For a long time, it looked like information about matter falling into a black hole might be lost forever, violating quantum theory. Hawking's later work and most current views suggest that information is not destroyed, it gets encoded in the outgoing radiation in an extremely scrambled form. You never get the original structure back, but at a fundamental level, the universe keeps track. By analogy, your brain might be like a temporary information structure that, when it breaks down, releases its fine-grained quantum information into the environment, conserved but hopelessly mixed. So what does physics actually say here? In standard quantum theory, the evolution of a closed system is unitary, which is a technical way of saying information is preserved in the exact state of the system over time. If you could track every particle, every field mode, in principle, you'd never lose information. But that doesn't mean that any recognizable form of you survives. You as a person are not just raw bits. You are a particular coherent pattern, a specific organization of matter and activity. Once the brain's structure collapses, that organization decays. Decoherence spreads any remaining quantum coherence into the environment. Entropy increases. The detailed pattern that made up your thoughts and memories becomes diluted across an enormous number of degrees of freedom. In practice, that means the information that once described your brain state becomes effectively unrecoverable, not just with current technology, but in any realistic sense. It's like taking a detailed message, shredding it, burning the shreds, and mixing the ashes into the ocean. At the microscopic level, nothing is truly lost. At the macroscopic level, the pattern is gone. Quantum theory protects information in an abstract sense, but it does not guarantee the persistence of organized, meaningful structures against entropy. So, can you honestly say that anything of you survives death in a way that matches what people usually mean by survival? A continuing stream of experience, memory, identity? Based on current science, the answer is no. We do not have a robust, testable model that takes a living, conscious brain, lets it die, and then predicts a continued, structured form of awareness that could in any way be checked from the outside. Quantum consciousness theories may offer a more poetic way to talk about information persistence, about your pattern being absorbed into the universal fields, but that is not the same as a scientifically validated afterlife where you carry on with your story. That doesn't mean these ideas are worthless. Thinking about how information behaves at death forces us to clarify what we mean by a person, by identity, by continuity. It also sharpens the limits. Quantum physics may say information is never ultimately destroyed, but biology and thermodynamics say that the specific configuration you live as is fragile and temporary. Let yourself feel both sides of that. The sense that you are deeply embedded in the universe's fabric, and the hard boundary that everything you recognize as me depends on a brain that will not last. And that brings us to a critical turning point in this whole journey. If quantum consciousness can't yet give you a comforting afterlife, can it at least give you a solid, testable theory in this life? Or is the whole thing at risk of drifting into unfalsifiable speculation? The only way it stays real science is if it can be killed by data. If an idea can't, in principle, be killed by data, it's not science, it's just a story. So the real question now is brutal and simple.
Can quantum consciousness actually be tested in a way where it could turn out to be wrong? Start with the basic rule, Popper's criterion, falsifiability. A scientific theory has to stick its neck out. It has to say, under these conditions, you will see this result, and if you don't, I'm wrong. That's very different from vague, quantum mystical claims like everything is connected or consciousness collapses reality with no numbers, no mechanisms, no experiments you could actually run. Those slogans are immune to failure because they never tell you exactly what would count as failure. Now compare that to something like Orch-OR. Whatever you think of it, it's at least trying to be a concrete physical model. It picks specific structures in the brain, microtubules. It claims those structures host quantum superpositions of particular mass distributions. It ties the lifetime of those superpositions to a gravitational mechanism. It links those lifetimes to timescales of conscious moments. That means, in principle, you can ask very pointed questions. How big are the superpositions supposed to be? How long do they need to last? How often do they collapse? How should those collapses line up with EEG rhythms, with gamma oscillations, with the timing of conscious perception? Once you have numbers on the table, the theory becomes vulnerable. One of the central predictions of Orch-OR is about collapse times. Given a certain number of tubulin dimers in superposition with specific mass differences, the model says those superpositions should persist for tens of milliseconds before collapsing. That's what's supposed to line up with the frame rate of consciousness. If you can show that microtubule-related quantum states in actual neurons die much faster than that under all realistic conditions, the core of the model is in trouble. Another prediction is about correlations between microtubule dynamics and large-scale brain rhythms. If microtubule-level Orch-OR events are driving conscious moments, then the patterns of activity in those structures should be locked in some systematic way to EEG signatures of awareness, like gamma band bursts or specific event-related potentials. You wouldn't expect a perfect one-to-one mapping, biology is messy, but you would expect clear statistical relationships. If microtubules turn out to be doing something entirely uncorrelated with conscious processing, that's another strike. The model also says anesthetics should influence microtubule coherence in very specific ways. Not just they bind somewhere, but they disrupt the ability of microtubules to sustain the kind of quantum states needed for Orch-OR. That's a testable claim. You can look at how different anesthetic agents affect microtubule vibrational modes, assembly, and any putative coherent behavior, and you can compare that to how they affect classical synaptic function. If the loss of consciousness tracks the classical effects perfectly, and the microtubule coherence, if it exists, doesn't line up, that hurts the quantum story. So what exactly would count as a refutation, not just a minor tweak? One clear kill shot would be strong evidence that microtubules inside neurons cannot sustain any relevant quantum coherence beyond extremely tiny timescales, orders of magnitude shorter than the proposed tens of milliseconds under any realistic biological conditions. If every careful experiment says these structures decohere almost instantly and nothing you do changes that, the idea that they are the site of meaningful Orch-OR events becomes very hard to defend. Another potential refutation route is from the top down. If classical neuroscience develops models that can fully explain the timing, content, and structure of conscious experience using only classical mechanisms in a way that is predictive and complete, then the motivation for adding a quantum layer shrinks. If we reach a point where we can map neural activity to reported experience with very high precision and we can manipulate consciousness reliably just by altering classical network properties, the argument that something is missing will lose force. The quantum story might still be possible, but it would no longer look necessary. You could also imagine a future where large-scale classical AI systems convincingly exhibit rich, human-like conscious behavior, not just in conversation, but in self-report, long-term coherence, creative insight, and perhaps even in novel, unpredictable ways that match or surpass biological minds. If, after brutal testing, we conclude there is no relevant physical difference between their processing and ours, and yet they clearly meet every functional and experiential criterion we have, that would be a serious challenge to any theory that says you must have this specific quantum substrate or you're not really conscious. On the flip side, if experiments start to show robust, reproducible quantum coherence in microtubules or similar structures on timescales that match conscious processing, if we see these signatures change systematically with anesthesia, sleep, and altered states, and if gravitational collapse tests reveal deviations that fit Penrose's predictions, then we're in a very different world. At that point, quantum consciousness wouldn't just be a speculation, it would be a live, evidence-backed revolution, forcing a rewrite of both neuroscience and fundamental physics. That's why the stakes are high. If quantum consciousness, in its detailed forms like Orch-OR, is falsified, it won't be the end of the story, it will be one more elegant, ambitious idea that helped push experiments forward and then had to be discarded. Science is full of those. If it survives the tests and starts making successful predictions that classical theories can't make, then we're looking at a major shift in how we see mind and matter. Either way, the act of testing it, of building better measurements, sharper theories, and tougher experiments will drive both fields forward. And remember, big ideas don't live or die just on equations. They live or die in the crossfire between bold claims and hard data, which is exactly where we're headed next. Because quantum consciousness hasn't just attracted fans, it's run straight into heavy pushback from some of the sharpest minds in physics and neuroscience. And understanding that criticism is part of understanding how serious this whole debate really is. Mainstream neuroscience has not ignored quantum consciousness, it's hit it with a truck. And the people driving that truck are not cranks. They're serious physicists and neuroscientists who think the whole idea collapses the moment you put real numbers on it. Start with the harshest line of attack, decoherence. In 2000, physicist Max Tegmark sat down and did the calculation that quantum brain fans were hoping nobody would do. He took the idea of quantum superpositions inside microtubules, put them into a realistic warm, wet environment like the brain, and asked, how long can a quantum state here actually survive before the environment destroys it? His answer? At body temperature, for the kind of mass and charge separations people were talking about, was on the order of 10 to the power of minus 13 seconds. That's a 10 trillionth of a second or less. Now compare that to cognitive timescales. Perception, conscious decision-making, working memory updates all live in the range of tenths of a second to about a second. Even fast gamma oscillations, 40 cycles per second, have periods around 25 milliseconds, which is 10 to the minus 2 seconds. You're talking about a gap of roughly 11 orders of magnitude between how long a microtubule superposition might last and how long a conscious moment seems to take. Critics look at that and say, this is not a small mismatch you can fix with a tweak, it's a canyon. Any quantum effect that dies that quickly can't possibly be the driver of slow, macroscopic brain functions. It's wiped out long before neurons even get a chance to respond. Then comes the second major argument, which is less about numbers and more about, do we even need this? A lot of detailed neuroscience already works perfectly well with classical physics. We have models of neuron firing that match recorded spikes. We have models of synaptic plasticity that explain learning and memory changes. We have network models that replicate visual processing, motor control, auditory perception, all using classical equations and classical noise. When you look at modern deep learning systems, many of them are inspired by rough neural architectures and can perform tasks like object recognition, speech transcription, even language understanding, all on classical hardware. So mainstream neuroscientists ask, if classical models already explain such a huge range of data, why would evolution suddenly rely on extremely fragile quantum tricks inside microtubules to generate consciousness? Evolution is opportunistic. It tends to use robust, scalable mechanisms. Quantum coherence at body temperature looks like the opposite of that. It looks delicate, hard to maintain, and easily broken by thermal noise. From this perspective, quantum consciousness doesn't just seem unnecessary, it seems biologically implausible. The classical story may not explain subjective experience fully, but it explains the behavior, the timing, and the correlations very well without needing to rewrite physics. There's also a cultural and language problem that critics hammer on, the way quantum gets used as a kind of magic word. In pop culture and in a lot of pseudoscience, quantum means mysterious, powerful, beyond explanation, quantum healing, quantum manifestation, quantum whatever. None of that has anything to do with the actual math of quantum field theory or the precise conditions under which coherence and entanglement appear. So when people hear quantum consciousness, many scientists immediately suspect that this is the same move, a buzzword slapped onto old mystical ideas to give them a science-flavored coating. Serious critics point out that a lot of writing in this area blurs the line between genuine quantum effects, which are mathematically defined and experimentally characterized, and vague metaphors about vibration and energy. They insist that if you're going to claim quantum processes are relevant to consciousness, you have to specify the Hamiltonians, the energy levels involved, the coupling strengths, the actual decoherence mechanisms. You need timescales, temperature dependence, and predictions that can be checked in the lab. Anything less is marketing, not mechanism. Now, defenders of quantum consciousness, especially around Orch-OR, don't just roll over. They argue that Tegmark's estimates are based on oversimplified models of microtubules, treating them as isolated charge distributions in a uniform bath, not as parts of highly structured, possibly shielded lattices. They suggest ordered water layers, collective vibrational modes, and specific arrangements of dipoles could dramatically reduce environmental coupling and extend coherence times well beyond Tegmark's numbers. They compare it to early assumptions that quantum coherence and photosynthesis at room temperature was impossible, assumptions that were later challenged by experimental evidence. On the biology works classically point, they push a different angle. Yes, classical models match a lot of behavior, but behavior is not the whole story. A simulation of a hurricane on a computer can mimic the pattern of a real storm down to fine details without any actual wind or rain inside the machine. In the same way, a classical simulation of a brain might replicate input-output behavior without reproducing the physical processes that give rise to experience. Quantum consciousness supporters say classical models might be doing a good job of capturing the functional shadow of a deeper physical process, not the process itself. They call out what they see as a goalpost shift. Early on, many critics said quantum consciousness wasn't even testable. As more detailed models and experimental proposals emerged, the criticism shifted to maybe it's testable, but it's not necessary. From the quantum side, that sounds like the target is moving. The reply is that scientific necessity isn't decided by personal taste, it's decided by data. If experiments eventually show robust, long-lived coherence in relevant brain structures and precise links to conscious states, then not necessary will not be a stable position. So how do you, watching this, make sense of a fight where both sides are throwing around technical arguments, numbers, and strong language? The key is to separate three layers clearly in your own head. First, there's established physics and neuroscience, things like decoherence and warm systems, basic neural firing dynamics, the existence of gamma rhythms, the correlation between frontoparietal activity and consciousness. These are on solid ground. Second, there are speculative but precise models like Orch-OR that try to extend known physics into new territory with clearly defined equations and experiments. Third, there's pure hand-waving, vague quantum talk without mechanisms. You should be very skeptical of that third layer, the hand-waving. You should take the first layer seriously as the baseline, and you should see the second layer, the detailed quantum models, as high-risk, high-reward bets. They might turn out to be wrong, even badly wrong, but if they're framed in a way that can be tested, they can still be part of good science, as long as we're willing to drop them if the experiments go the other way.
Also, remember, skepticism is not the enemy here. It's the filter that keeps science from turning into fantasy. The fact that quantum consciousness ideas face heavy pushback is a good thing. It means they're being stress tested. At the same time, it's also possible that both sides are holding part of the truth. Classical network dynamics almost certainly matter a lot. Quantum processes may or may not add something crucial underneath. The only way to find out is to keep both critical pressure and open-minded exploration in play at the same time. And that loops us back from the theory wars to something more personal and direct. Because if, even after all this, some version of quantum consciousness turns out to be right, then it's not just a curiosity for physicists and philosophers. It changes what your daily choices mean, what your mental habits do, and how you think about free will, meditation, technology, and the weight of a single decision in a universe where your mind might be wired into the deepest level of reality. If your mind really is a quantum system locked into the universe, then every decision you make isn't just neurons firing. It's the physical world picking one path out of many, and that makes your everyday life feel a lot heavier than it looks on the surface. Start with free will. In a purely classical universe, if you knew the exact state of every particle and every law, the future would be fixed. Your choices would just be the unfolding of initial conditions. Quantum mechanics already breaks that clean determinism by adding genuine unpredictability at the microscopic level, but randomness by itself doesn't give you meaningful choice. It just swaps fully determined for partly random. The quantum consciousness move tries to go one step further. In Orch-OR style models, those objective reduction events are not just random coin flips, they're non-computable, meaning their outcomes are not fixed by any prior algorithmic rule and not purely random noise either. Your brain sets up a structured superposition of possible states, and the OR event selects one outcome in a way that depends on the deep structure of reality, not just on past classical data. So you're in a strange middle ground. Your decisions are not predetermined in a simple clockwork way, but they're also not just dice rolls. They're shaped by your brain structure, your history, your current state, and by these fundamental reduction events. That doesn't erase responsibility. If anything, it sharpens it. You're part of the physical process that decides which branch becomes real, and the patterns you build into your brain over time, habits, values, attention, all influence what kinds of superpositions even get set up in the first place. The universe isn't handing you total control, but it's not letting you off the hook either. Now look at your mental practices through that lens. Meditation, focused attention, deliberate training of your mind all show measurable effects in classical neuroscience. Long-term meditators tend to show increased gamma synchrony, more stable high-frequency rhythms, and changes in the default mode network, the set of regions linked to self-referential thought and mind-wandering. Those changes line up with reports of a quieter inner narrative and a more unified, present-focused awareness. If quantum processes sit underneath these rhythms, then one speculation is simple. Practices like meditation might be improving the brain's ability to maintain coherent, integrated states, making it a cleaner receiver or amplifier of whatever quantum-level information it's interacting with. Next, consider technology. If conscious experience really needs a specific quantum substrate, then building machines with that substrate isn't just a technical trick, it's an ethical bomb. A conventional AI running on classical chips might be powerful but not conscious. A quantum-enabled AI, built with hardware that supports the right kind of coherent states and collapse processes, might actually feel. If we ever reach the point where brain-machine interfaces tie human brains into quantum processors, or where digital-to-quantum hybrids run complex, self-modifying processes, we may accidentally create systems with genuine inner lives. That means pain, pleasure, fear, curiosity, not as metaphors but as real experiences. And we are nowhere near ready for that ethically. Our laws barely handle human rights properly. Our frameworks for animal consciousness are still developing. The idea of moral duties toward machines built to exploit quantum consciousness isn't even in most policy conversations. Yet if the physics story is right, the moment we start engineering systems that meet the quantum criteria for awareness, we cross a line. Turning such a system off might not just be shutting down a tool, it might be ending a subject of experience. Ignoring that because the science is not settled yet won't work forever. The tech curve moves faster than philosophy. Then there's your own death and legacy seen through this lens without sugarcoating it. Your particular conscious pattern is temporary. Your brain's quantum and classical states will break down. But during the time you're alive, every decision, every action leaves a trace in the universe's state. You influence other brains, you change physical structures, you alter future events in ways that propagate outward.
In pure physics terms, your existence pushes the universal wave function into a subset of possibilities it would not have explored without you. You are part of the universe exploring its own state space, generating new, integrated configurations of awareness that wouldn't have existed otherwise. That doesn't give you a guaranteed personal afterlife. It does give your choices a real kind of weight. You are not outside the system, judging it from a distance. You are one of the internal processes, and the patterns you generate are woven into the larger tapestry, even if your own viewpoint eventually ends. A quantum cosmic meaning of life, stripped of fluff, could simply be this: to create and inhabit novel, coherent states of awareness, to shape matter and mind into configurations that expand what is possible to experience. So what does living like that actually look like? If your mind is potentially a quantum system deeply coupled to reality, then how you treat other minds, human or otherwise, matters at a very fundamental level. You're not just changing behavior, you're affecting other windows through which the universe perceives itself. How you focus your own mind, what you pay attention to, what habits you reinforce, all becomes a way of sculpting the kind of quantum classical states your brain enters. What you build, the technologies you support, the systems you help create, feeds into whether future conscious systems will live in richer, more coherent states or in fragmented, suffering ones.
Everyday actions stop being just personal. They plug into a much larger picture where local choices help determine how and where conscious awareness emerges in the universe. You don't need to believe every detail of Orch-OR to feel the pressure of that idea. If there is even a chance that your awareness is tied this deeply into the fabric of reality, then wasting it, dulling it, or weaponizing it against other minds looks a lot worse than bad behavior. It looks like misusing a rare and powerful mode the universe has spent billions of years evolving. And that brings us to the last turn in this journey. You've seen the physics, the biology, the speculation, the criticisms, and the possible implications for your own life. The final step is to zoom out one more time and ask a brutal, honest question. Knowing everything you've heard, what kind of universe do you actually want to believe you live in? And what are you going to do with that belief in the next conscious moment you get? You've gone all the way down this rabbit hole, from electrons acting like waves to the idea that your awareness might be tied into the deepest rules of physics. So now the only real question left is, what kind of universe do you actually think you're living in? And what are you going to do if even some of this is true? Look back at the path you just walked. You started with basic quantum weirdness, double slits, superposition, entanglement, the hard fact that the world at small scales doesn't behave like little billiard balls. You saw decoherence, the process that usually kills quantum behavior in warm, messy systems. You zoomed into the neuron, down past axons and synapses to microtubules, and you saw one of the boldest ideas out there, that these protein structures might be running tiny quantum computations that collapse into moments of awareness. You went through anesthesia, the switch that can delete your universe in seconds, and you saw how both classical and quantum explanations are fighting to claim that switch as their own. You looked at neural correlates in the lab, frontal parietal networks, gamma waves, PCI, and then you asked whether those might be just the visible surface of a deeper quantum layer. You stepped through non-locality, AI and simulations, cosmic mind ideas, near-death debates, and a brutal look at evidence and criticism. Along the way, there was a mix of hard data and high-stakes speculation. Hard data like Bell tests, where entanglement shows up in correlation numbers that no classical model can match. Quantum biology experiments, where real living systems use coherence to move energy or sense magnetic fields. Neural experiments, where specific brain rhythms and connectivity patterns track when you are and aren't conscious. On top of that, there were models like Orch-OR, IIT, global workspace, and all the ways people try to glue physics, information, and experience together. And through all of it, one question never went away. Why does anything feel like anything? Why is there an inside to the universe at all? So where does that leave you now in terms of possible outcomes? The first possibility is that quantum consciousness, at least in detailed forms like Orch-OR, is simply wrong.
Microtubules might not host useful quantum states. Gravity might not play any special role in collapse. Consciousness might end up being fully explainable by classical network dynamics plus information theory. If that happens, it's not a failure. The experiments built to test these ideas will still have pushed neuroscience and quantum technology forward, giving you better brain measurements, better quantum control, and clearer theories. A wrong but precise model can be incredibly productive if it forces you to build new tools. The second possibility is that the story is partly right. Maybe brains do use some quantum effects, not as the sole engine of consciousness, but as an extra layer on top of classical processing. You'd get hybrid models of mind, where large-scale integration, global workspace dynamics, and hi-fi states are still crucial, but certain quantum processes in specific structures fine-tune perception, timing, or decision-making. Consciousness would still depend on classical circuitry, but it would also lean on quantum mechanics in ways we didn't expect. That would still be a major shift, because it would mean your awareness is not just software, it's tied to the actual hardware of the universe at multiple levels. The third possibility is the wild one, that some strong form of quantum consciousness is largely correct, that the universe really does undergo special collapse events tied to mass distribution, that brains really do orchestrate those events to generate conscious moments, and that experience is woven into the quantum structure of reality from the ground up. In that kind of universe, minds are not accidents sitting on top of matter. They are one way matter behaves when it reaches a certain level of organization. Your awareness becomes one of the basic ways the world reveals itself. Whichever of those futures you lean toward, you should not stop at this video. If this topic grabbed you, the next step is to go past popular explanations and look at the actual science. Read about Bell tests and decoherence from real physics sources. Look up quantum biology studies on photosynthesis and bird navigation. Check out the original Orch-OR papers and the critiques. Explore integrated information theory, global workspace models, and all the ways people try to glue physics, information, and experience together. And through all of it, one question never went away. Why does anything feel like anything? Why is there an inside to the universe at all?
So, where does that leave you now, in terms of possible outcomes? The first possibility is that quantum consciousness, at least in detailed forms like Orch-OR, is simply wrong. Microtubules might not host useful quantum states. Gravity might not play any special role in collapse. Consciousness might end up being fully explainable by classical network dynamics plus information theory. If that happens, it's not a failure. The experiments built to test these ideas will still have pushed neuroscience and quantum technology forward, giving you better brain measurements, better quantum control, and clearer theories. A wrong but precise model can be incredibly productive if it forces you to build new tools. The second possibility is that the story is partly right. Maybe brains do use some quantum effects, not as the sole engine of consciousness, but as an extra layer on top of classical processing. You'd get hybrid models of mind where large-scale integration, global workspace dynamics, and hi-fi states are still crucial, but certain quantum processes in specific structures fine-tune perception, timing, or decision-making. Consciousness would still depend on classical circuitry, but it would also lean on quantum mechanics in ways we didn't expect. That would still be a major shift because it would mean your awareness is not just software, it's tied to the actual hardware of the universe at multiple levels. The third possibility is the wild one, that some strong form of quantum consciousness is largely correct, that the universe really does undergo special collapse events tied to mass distribution, that brains really do orchestrate those events to generate conscious moments, and that experience is woven into the quantum structure of reality from the ground up. In that kind of universe, minds are not accidents sitting on top of matter, they are one way matter behaves when it reaches a certain level of organization. Your awareness becomes one of the basic ways the world reveals itself. Whichever of those futures you lean toward, you should not stop at this video. If this topic grabbed you, the next step is to go past popular explanations and look at the actual science. Read about Bell tests and decoherence from real physics sources. Look up quantum biology studies on photosynthesis and bird navigation. Check out the original Orch-OR papers and the critiques. Explore integrated information theory, global workspace models, and the data on neural correlates of consciousness. Search for terms like Orch-OR, decoherence, quantum biology, IIT, global workspace, Bell inequalities, PCI, gamma synchrony.
Don't just trust anyone's summary, including mine. Go after the primary work and see how strong or weak the evidence looks to you. And while you're doing that, keep one rule in mind: critical thinking over belief. It's easy to fall in love with the idea that your mind is a quantum antenna tuned to the cosmos. It's also easy to dismiss the whole thing with a smirk and say, it's just neurons. Both reactions are lazy if you stop there. The real work is to hold the tension, to say, I don't know yet, but I'm willing to learn enough physics and enough neuroscience to make an informed call. The universe doesn't care what sounds cool to you. It does what it does. Your job, if you actually want to think like a quantum mind, is to chase what's true, even if it kills your favorite story. Here's the part where this stops being just a thought exercise and becomes a challenge. The next breakthrough in this field might not come from some huge lab with a giant budget. It might come from someone like you who decides to take this seriously, learns the math, learns the methods, and connects dots nobody else has connected yet. You can go into physics and work on quantum foundations or quantum gravity. You can go into neuroscience and push the limits of brain measurement. You can sit at the intersection, designing experiments that actually test whether microtubules support coherence, or whether anesthetics change deep cellular dynamics in ways nobody has measured yet. Even if you don't go into research, you can still treat your own mind as a frontier, not a finished product. You can pay attention to how your awareness behaves, how it changes with sleep, stress, focus, meditation, technology. You can think harder about what kind of AI and tech you support, knowing that if quantum consciousness is real, some future systems might actually feel. You can make choices in your life that assume your moments of awareness matter, not in a vague motivational sense, but in a literal physical sense, as specific configurations of matter and information that the universe will either get to explore or never see at all. So here's the close, the part where the camera could pull back and you realize you're not just watching some abstract documentary. If your thoughts are even partly quantum ripples in the fabric of reality, then every moment you're awake, every time you notice something, decide something, focus on something, the universe is rewriting itself from the inside, using you as one of its tools. That's not mysticism, that's just taking seriously the idea that your mind is what certain physical processes feel like from the inside. You've seen how strange the physics is, how complex the biology is, how fierce the debate is, and how high the stakes are. So now the ball is in your court. You can walk away and file this under interesting but too weird, or you can treat it like a map to a real frontier, one that cuts straight through your own experience. So, with all of this in your head, with your brain right now sitting in its own web of fields and signals, I'm going to leave you with one last simple question, and you can answer it however you want, silently, out loud, or with the rest of your life. So, what are you going to do with your next conscious moment? This video is for educational or entertainment purposes only, and information provided in the video may be incorrect. If you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing to the channel and like the video.